In what ways does nature inspire you?
I really think it's healing. I don't know how else to explain it.
Even in the colder months, you'll usually see a whole bunch of ducks and other forms of wildlife just living their best lives.
I like how cheetahs can run.
I've worked in an outdoor science camp for 40 years, all my life pretty much. I had one little girl ask me, who left the faucet on so long, because we were looking at the Pacific Ocean one time. She couldn't believe there was so much water out there.
There are also parks like Lake Waterford. I've been actually going there since I was probably like 2 years old, maybe one.
I think that's probably one of my favorite parts about nature is just the boundlessness of it, especially as a kid. There's always new things to discover.
We are nature. It's the roots.
I love just being outside in nature. It just makes you feel a certain way that you can't from being on your phone or something.
When you're at a beach, it's like you only hear the water and it's peaceful. It's like, it's good.
We're living through one of the most environmentally fraught periods of our history as humans. Air pollution is unprecedented in developing countries, leading to 7 million premature deaths every year. Experts estimate there are 5.3 trillion pieces of plastic waste in the ocean. The last year saw record-breaking weather patterns, heat waves, droughts, storms, and flooding. Every single person I spoke to cared about these issues, and the majority accepted that these problems are by and large the result of human action. And these numbers track on a national scale. 65% of Americans are personally worried about global warming. 2/3 think that the government should be doing more to reduce its effects. But despite this, the United States is far from reaching the goals experts have said are necessary to mitigate long-term effects of climate change.
That happens for a lot of complicated reasons, right? The cynical response would be that people say they care about nature, or they think they care about nature more than they actually do. A less cynical way of thinking about it is that we're all caught up in a version of what's called the tragedy of the commons, right? The tragedy of the commons happens when we have a distributed good that we can all access, like the environment, the climate, for example, like that. And that each of our interactions with that on its own is damaging in a way that seems insignificant, but collectively together, it makes enough damage to be very significant, but with respect to climate change.
Because of that, our response to climate change needs to take place both at the individual and collective level.
It's important to do both, right? It's important to do individual actions. People should be doing things like biking more, eating less meat, traveling less, things. Those individual actions are meaningful in a broader scope, but on their own, they're not going to solve climate change. To solve climate change and these sort of commons problems I mentioned, there has to be a collective response.
The problem is that this is unfolding during one of the greatest periods of partisan polarization in American history. And according to a Pew Research Center survey conducted in 2020, the issue Republicans and Democrats are most divided on is climate change.
Of national attention, and in case we have forgotten, because we keep hearing that 2014 has been the warmest year on record, I asked the chair, you know what this is? It's a snowball, and that's just from outside here. So it's very, very cold out, very unseasonal. So here, Mr. President.
When snowballs become scientific evidence and ideology blinds us from facts, it's difficult to reach agreements on partisan issues like climate change. But there are other environmental topics where bipartisanship is possible. For example, sea turtles.
You guys are going to be surprised at this, but we passed a bill that would be it's called the Sea Turtle Bill.
Senator Inhofe, who has been a sea turtle enthusiast for decades, co-sponsored the Marine Turtle Conservation Act, which funds projects to protect endangered turtle populations. It's just one of the dozens of bipartisan conservation laws that rarely include the term climate change, but can make a significant difference for those most vulnerable to the planet's changing climate. Amongst them is the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, a law that passed with bipartisan support and promotes conservation efforts in the Great Lakes. One species that this act protects is the Great Lakes piping plover. Characterized by their small, sand-colored body, orange bill, and charismatic personality, piping plovers can be found across much of the Atlantic coast and Midwest. The Great Lakes population, however, is in danger of extinction.
My goal has been to increase the population so that it could be delisted. Whether or not that's possible, I really don't know. There's lots and lots of challenges.
Dr. Francie Cuthbert is a researcher at the University of Minnesota and has been a pioneer in the study of Great Lakes piping plovers, bringing attention to the population in the 1980s, when there were only approximately a dozen pairs in existence.
I was told at first that I was wasting my time, that the Great Lakes just had birds coming from elsewhere, from the Great Plains or from Atlantic coast. And so we started banding and marking individuals, and found that it was very clear very soon that the Great Lakes was a unique population. The birds that nest there, produce young there, come back. They're not dispersing and going elsewhere.
After Cuthbert proved that Great Lakes piping plovers were a unique population, local organizations began to take action to protect them.
The numbers have gone from around a dozen at listing up to in the 70s. So that's all very positive.
Now, piping plovers are nesting across the Great Lakes region. And then in the summer of 2021, something historic happened.
I actually had stopped at the beach one morning in May, and I found them there. I wasn't even positive that they were piping plovers. I was taking pictures and filming them, and they started doing the male started doing the little high step, and I was pretty sure from the limited knowledge that I had that was a mating dance. So I happened to be there in the beginning when they did their little mating ritual.
A month later, the two piping plovers became the first pair to nest in Ohio in 83 years.
That's huge because generally when you're talking about a population of animals that's under study, recovery, research, you always have a historic distribution. Historically, the Great Lakes plovers were all over.
But as the plover population dwindled, they retreated for the most part into a small region in northern Michigan.
It's so important to have multiple sites with piping plovers, and so yes, Ohio only has one pair. Yes, Illinois only has one pair. But say our site at Silver Lake State Dunes has 3 pairs, and all of them get washed out because of a weather event. We're grateful to have not all of our eggs literally in one basket.
And scientists were not the only ones thrilled to see plovers resettle in Ohio. Ordinary citizens also rose up to the occasion, volunteering thousands of hours to patrolling the beach and protecting the nest of plovers.
So volunteers were there from sunrise until night, usually about 10 o'clock at night, especially in midsummer.
Christy Frank is one of the 4 volunteers who provided more than 400 hours.
You fall in love with these birds. They weren't just all piping plovers. They were Nish and Nellie and Kickapoo and Mommy and Ottawa and Erie, and each one of them had an individual personality. Some of them were much more aggressive at exploring and being brave, and other ones were a little more, I'm gonna hang around mom and dad for a while. So I think that opportunity is what kept me coming back, and the opportunity to learn and to hopefully make a difference.
But as months passed, one chick caught the attention of researchers.
And then they started to notice that this particular one, Erie, looked like it had a medical problem. And we watched her for a little bit, and then it was decided that she needed medical treatment. She was taken to the Toledo Zoo for a couple weeks and treated for her medical problem, and it resolved, and then she was released back into the beach.
When Erie was re-released, Her siblings had already begun the annual piping plover migration south to warmer waters.
And it was just kind of a waiting game, waiting to for her to fledge and actually migrate and head south. And she didn't. And then she didn't some more. And they got to be September and October. And historically, you don't see piping plovers in this part of the area in beginning of September. They have all dispersed and headed south. So it was very unusual that Erie was here in September, and then it became October, and it was kind of clear that she was not going to migrate. And if we had not intervened and brought her back into captivity, she wouldn't have been able to handle the wintertime, and she would have been deceased. So this is an unusual situation and an odd situation, but we had to step in and do something. And we still have high hopes that we can release her this summer as we're rearing chicks up north, that she'll be releasable.
At the Detroit Zoo, Erie is kept in a private pen away from visitors. She spends her day on her personal beach, listening to wave sounds playing off a loudspeaker, and one of her favorite pastimes, looking at herself in the mirror. But once she is re-released, Erie will discover the multitude of threats that piping plovers face in the wild.
Piping plovers are a shoreline specialist, and so they all only occur along the Great Lakes shoreline, at least our Great Lakes population. And so it kind of limits the amount of habitat that they have available.
Throughout the Great Lakes, the primary threats remain habitat loss. And I include within that habitat loss due to recreation pressure.
As humans have increased their use along the coast in the Great Lakes, it has limited the habitat available for the piping plover.
But there's a bunch of other threats as well. Predation remains a big threat. You know, obviously predation's a natural phenomenon, but because we've already reduced the population to such a level, and we've also changed the number and kinds of predators that the birds face because of anthropogenic changes to the landscape, predation is still a really big threat to the birds.
Climate change adds yet another hurdle that plovers will have to face.
2020, water levels were unprecedented in terms of their height. And that in combination with some severe weather wiped out a bunch of nests, caused birds to re-nest and re-nest later. It really affected their productivity.
As water levels rise, the precious habitat space plovers occupy will be further reduced, and warming temperatures means less ice coverage on the lakes, which leads to even more habitat loss. On top of that, scientists are also seeing an increase in storm frequency.
We had an issue in 2020 where we had these Seaches events that were happening up at Sleeping Bear, where just this huge kind of storm came in and knocked out probably, I think, 7 of our nests, which was a huge number. And it's just, these events are happening more often, and it's just something that we need to be prepared for.
Perhaps most concerning is that experts don't know with certainty how and when the effects of climate change are going to play out, and that makes it harder to protect piping plovers from them.
We don't know. We don't know what's going to be around the corner. We can try to make our best educated guesses, looking at trends, looking at water level trends, ice cover trends, trying to track weather, and trying to see how quickly a storm will be coming in. But it makes it hard to do long-term planning.
Across the country, on the shores of California, a very different species is also suffering from climate change. If you've ever visited San Francisco, chances are you've stopped by Pier 39 to see the hundreds of sea lions that gather on the pier. They are only a small fraction of the more than 200,000 sea lions that live on the coast of California. But starting in 2013, experts and volunteers began to observe thousands of stranded young sea lions.
Finally tonight, the rescue effort to save hundreds of baby sea lions stranded on California beaches. For a third year, they're washing ashore in big numbers and no one knows exactly why.
But now, we know why: unusually warm ocean temperatures. Sometimes, warmer waters are a result of natural phenomena, such as El Niño events, but experts say these cycles will be worsened by climate change.
When we burn fossil fuels, things like coal, oil, methane gas, what happens is we release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and that's acting kind of like a heat-trapping blanket, trapping the air and warming the kind of land, sea, and air. And unfortunately, what happens then is those warm waters, the fish, for the most part, that the seals and sea lions go after, are now seeking colder water. So they're going deeper, they're going farther offshore. And young seals and sea lions in particular just aren't able to dive deeper or go farther. And we're seeing them wash up on the California shores, really just in dire straits. And that's where the Marine Mammal Center comes in to rescue them, bring them to the hospital, and try and give them a second chance at life.
Adam Ratner works at the Marine Mammal Center in Sausalito, California, just north of San Francisco. Since 1975, the Marine Mammal Center has rescued more than 24,000 animals off the coast of California and in Hawaii. One of these patients is the sea lion Palomino.
He has been in care for leptospirosis, which is a bacterial disease that causes essentially renal failure or renal disease, glomerulonephritis, so inflammation of the kidneys. And we're seeing him. This is typically a normal time of the year we start to see these animals is in the fall. So he's been in care for about a month. He came in really thin and skinny and malnourished.
When malnourished sea lions first come in, it's important to build up their weight. One of their top menu items are these scrumptious-looking fish smoothies.
And now he's eating and he's gained weight and he's looking really good. So what we're doing today is his release exam.
To conduct the release exam, Dr. Rivard relies on the help of volunteers.
So what that involves is giving him a sedative, just because he's gained some weight and he's nice and active and bright and feisty, so it makes him a little bit easier to handle and less stressful for him if we sedate him. And we're using a net called the New Zealand net in order to safely restrain him. So part of the exam was to take some blood work. We're going to do a physical, so look him over from basically his nose to the tip of his tail, and perhaps do an ultrasound on his kidneys as well.
Although the procedure may appear shocking to onlookers, it's designed to safely ensure that Palomino is ready to be released into the ocean. Without treatment, the effects of Palomino's malnutrition could have been fatal.
Unfortunately, malnutrition, if they get thin and skinny enough and they aren't able to adequately forage, they can pass away from primary malnutrition, which is something that we can see in some of the younger pups and even the yearlings. It can also predispose them to diseases down the road. So if they have that compromise, then it makes them more likely to get secondary diseases as well.
Sea lions, amongst other marine mammals, are one of the species that have caught politicians' hearts.
The reason I ran for Congress was because of climate change. Here at the Marine Mammal Center, you see the effects of climate change and harming the marine mammals, and that's another reason we need to absolutely work on climate change. And to work on it in a bipartisan manner, my hope is we'll get some Republican support.
California Representative Ted Lieu hoped President Biden's proposed Build Back Better bill, a bill that included climate change initiatives, would get bipartisan support. But that never happened. Still, it doesn't mean bipartisanship is impossible.
What you try to do is find pieces of issues that can be beneficial for either decarbonization or for adaptation and resilience. And often you need to package them in something other than climate change. So coastal resiliency is one of those relatively not radicalized ways of framing this. And we have found opportunities to work on a bipartisan basis on coastal resiliency.
But Huffman himself admits that when it comes to tackling climate change directly, it's nearly impossible to get Republican support.
Honestly, if you want to get to the heart of what needs to happen, which is decarbonization of the economy, dramatic transformation of the transportation sector away from fossil fuels, there are very few Republicans who will work with you on that, even now, even in the wake of the IPCC's latest report, even with climate change giving us a daily wake-up call just about everywhere in the world.
According to Loyola Marymount University environmental philosophy professor Dr. Brian Traynor, that comes down to us, the voters.
What we need to do is make climate change a voting issue for people so that climate change gets the same kind of attention here in the United States that gun rights get, or that abortion rights get, or things like this. When people win or lose elections based on their stance on climate change, policies will change.
The good news is that more and more Americans are beginning to see climate change as a voting issue. And it's not just Democrats. 78% of millennial Republicans not only believe in climate change, but support policies to decarbonize our economy. Only when those voters demand that their representatives address climate change will they begin to do so. But in the meantime, it's important to continue to make the effort to live more sustainable lives, not just for the sake of the environment, but also for the sake of our personal flourishing.
If we look at environmental problems through that lens, through the lens of what it means to flourish and live a good, happy, joyful life, I do think it changes some of the arguments from prohibition, from the sort of imperative case, to the optative mood, the hopeful mood, right? If you tell someone you're not allowed to own a larger house out in Valencia and drive your SUV in a 2-hour commute to downtown Los Angeles to work as an SUV, that seems like a prohibition to the person. But if instead you have a conversation about them, like, what kind of life do you want? Do you really want a life where you're commuting 3 hours a day in traffic on the 405? Is that what's conducive to your flourishing, the flourishing of your children, your family, your wife, your relationship? They might start to think differently about the choice they've made, and they might start to think, well, maybe it would be worth living in a smaller house or a condo closer to where I worked, because I'd have more time with my children, because I'd have less time on this freeway that's driving me crazy with bumper-to-bumper traffic. One of the underappreciated arguments to be made is that so many of the things that we need to do to solve environmental crisis are things that we should want to do for ourselves, even if there were no environmental crisis.
That applies to all of us, regardless of our backgrounds or ideologies. Living a life that is more attuned with nature, whether that be keeping Erie safe from beachgoers or helping Palomino make it back to the ocean. Whether it be biking to work, reducing meat intake, or thinking twice before buying that thing that you think you want but probably don't actually need, those actions make our lives better. And although they may seem small in the grand scheme of things, these actions matter.
One thing to remember when you're feeling despair.
Dr. Traynor told me of a conversation he had with a fellow environmentalist about tipping points. Points such as the loss of the Greenland ice sheet, thawing permafrost, or the destruction of the Amazon rainforest that once crossed could have irreversible effects.
My friend, who's also an environmentalist, told me, well, you got to remember there are also good tipping points, right? There are bad tipping points, and we got to be worried about those. But there are other good tipping points, other changes that as a tipping point we can't predict that change things for the better. When I was your age and I was in college and the Berlin Wall came down, no one could have predicted that would have happened over the week or two that it did, right? I mean, we knew the Cold War was going on. There were some people who hoped it might be changing and that the Soviet bloc was weakening in some way, but no one could have predicted that in the course of just this 1 month, like, the world changed. The world literally changed, right? And now it's harder to do that with respect to physics, as we were saying. Physics and chemistry don't negotiate. But I do think when we're tempted to despair, one thing we ought to remember is that we can't see the full picture, and we can't keep track of all the moving parts. And there might be reasons that things are not quite so dark and hopeless as they appear. You never know when someone's going to invent the next technology that's going to fundamentally alter the carbon economy that we seem locked into right now. So if you despair too early and give up a year before we were about to cross that positive tipping point, you gave up when we could have won, right? The only way to know you're going to lose the game is to sort of quit and not try.
Faced with a crisis as overwhelming as climate change, it's easy to feel insignificant, to succumb to peril. But small actions, the actions that Dr. Traynor believes are not only good for the planet, but also good for us as humans, serve as a promise to never stop searching for hope.